The night she opened her door to a man everyone else avoided, she thought she was saving a stranger from the storm. She had no idea the storm had already been chasing him for years. The rain came down so hard that it blurred the cracked windows of Emily Carter's tiny rental house into streaks of silver. Thunder rolled across the Kansas sky, rattling the loose gutters and making the lights flicker for the third time in 10 minutes. 8-year-old Noah looked up from the worn blanket wrapped around his shoulders and whispered, "Mom, do you think the power's going to go out again?" Emily forced a smile that hid the exhaustion carved into her face after another 14-hour day split between a grocery store shift and cleaning offices downtown. "Maybe," she said softly while setting a small pot of tomato soup on the stove. "But we've got candles this time." The little house smelled of damp wood, old paint, and the simple dinner she hoped would be enough until payday. She quietly counted the dollars left inside the chipped ceramic jar above the refrigerator. $23.16. Rent was already 4 days overdue. Her car needed brakes she couldn't afford. Winter coats were still on last year's shopping list. She closed the jar before Noah could notice how long she stared at it. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees with a force that bent branches almost to the ground. Then came another sound. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not desperate, just tired. Emily froze. Nobody visited this neighborhood during storms unless something had gone terribly wrong. Noah instinctively moved closer to her. Another knock echoed through the tiny living room. She stepped toward the window and gently pulled back the curtain. A tall man stood on her porch beneath the broken awning. His dark coat was soaked from head to toe. Rainwater dripped from his hair as he leaned one hand against the porch railing, breathing slowly as if every breath required effort. His beard was slightly overgrown, his clothes wrinkled, and from a distance he looked exactly like someone who had spent days with nowhere to go. Across the street, Mrs. Dawson cracked open her front door, just enough to shout over the storm, "Emily, don't answer that. Call the police if you have to." The man never looked toward the voice. He simply lowered his eyes and took one small step back from the door, almost apologizing without speaking. Emily watched him through the glass. There was something strangely calm about him. He wasn't pounding on the door. He wasn't demanding help. He wasn't asking for money. He simply looked cold. Very cold. Noah tugged gently on her sweater. "Mom, is he okay?" Emily looked at her son, then back at the stranger standing alone beneath the pounding rain. She remembered another storm years earlier when she had held a newborn baby in her arms, praying someone would simply show a little kindness. Most people had walked past without slowing down. She never forgot how that felt. Taking a slow breath, Emily unlocked the deadbolt. The hinges creaked as the door opened just wide enough for warm light to spill onto the porch. "You can come inside until the storm passes," she said quietly. The man lifted his eyes. They were remarkably clear despite the rain, carrying a quiet dignity that didn't seem to belong with the rest of his appearance. For the first time that night, he spoke. "Thank you," he said in a calm, steady voice. Most people wouldn't have opened the door. Emily stepped aside without realizing that in less than 48 hours, half the city would be searching for the man now wiping rain from his shoes before entering her home. Emily closed the door against the howling wind, and for a brief moment the tiny house fell into a comforting silence broken only by rain tapping against the roof. The stranger stood just inside the entryway, careful not to drip water across the worn wooden floor. He glanced down at his muddy boots before quietly removing them without being asked. It was such a small gesture that Emily almost missed it, yet it instantly separated him from every rude customer and impatient stranger she had dealt with during another exhausting week. She handed him an old towel that had faded from years of washing. "It is clean," she said apologetically. He accepted it with a grateful smile. "It is more than enough. Thank you." His voice carried an unusual calmness, smooth and measured, the kind that made people naturally lower their own voices without realizing it. Noah peeked from behind his mother with cautious curiosity. "Hi," the little boy said. "Hi," the man replied warmly. "I am glad someone is still awake tonight." Noah grinned despite himself. Emily noticed that the stranger never asked for food, money, or a phone. Instead, he looked around the modest living room with genuine appreciation, as though the peeling paint and secondhand furniture were luxuries instead of signs of hardship. Emily placed 3 bowls on the small kitchen table. There was barely enough soup for 2 adults and 1 growing child, but she quietly added a little more hot water and stirred it slowly. She hoped nobody would notice. The stranger did. When she served him, he looked at the bowl for several seconds before gently sliding half of it back toward the stove. "This is plenty," he said. "Please save the rest for breakfast." Emily hesitated. "You have not eaten." "Neither have you," he answered with a gentle smile. She did not know what to say because he was right. Noah climbed into his chair and happily dipped a cracker into the soup. "Mom makes the best tomato soup," he declared proudly. The stranger took 1 careful spoonful and nodded. "I believe your mother can make almost anything feel like home." Emily felt an unexpected warmth rise in her cheeks. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented something so ordinary. As the storm continued outside, Noah began talking without hesitation, telling stories about school, his favorite baseball team, and the stray orange cat that sometimes visited their porch. The stranger listened with complete attention, never interrupting, laughing softly at the right moments, asking thoughtful questions that made Noah feel important. Emily watched the conversation unfold while quietly washing the dishes. Most adults only pretended to listen to children. This man treated every answer as though it mattered. When Noah yawned, Emily tucked him into the narrow bedroom they shared. Before closing the door, Noah whispered, "Mom, he does not seem scary." Emily smiled softly. "No, sweetheart, he does not." When she returned, she found the stranger folding the towel neatly and placing it exactly where she had taken it from. "You have already done enough for me," he said. "I should leave once the rain slows." Emily looked through the window. Sheets of rain still covered the street, and lightning briefly illuminated the empty neighborhood. "You are not going anywhere tonight," she said firmly. "The couch is old, but it is dry." He looked at her with quiet surprise, as though kindness had become something unfamiliar. "Then I owe you more than I can repay," he said. Emily smiled as she spread an old quilt across the sofa. "Around here, we do not keep score." The stranger lowered his eyes for just a moment before looking back at the small family with an expression that seemed almost unfamiliar to him, as though he had spent years surrounded by everything money could buy and had somehow forgotten what it felt like to simply be welcomed inside. Morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling through clouds that had finally surrendered after a long night of rain. Emily woke before dawn as usual, quietly slipping out of bed so she would not wake Noah. She found the stranger already awake, standing on the small front porch with a steaming mug of coffee she had left on the counter. He was watching the neighborhood with thoughtful eyes, as though he had not simply been looking at the worn houses but trying to understand the lives inside them. "You should have slept longer," Emily said. He smiled gently. "Old habits are difficult to change." She noticed the blanket had been folded perfectly on the couch and the pillow carefully placed exactly where it belonged. Even the coffee mug he had borrowed the night before had already been washed and set on the drying rack. Few guests had ever treated her home with such quiet respect. Emily glanced toward the aging roof where fresh rainwater still dripped steadily into a bucket by the front door. "I keep meaning to fix that," she admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "Life keeps moving it lower on the list." The man looked up at the damaged shingles for only a moment before asking, "Do you have a ladder?" Emily blinked. "You know how to repair roofs?" "I know enough to stop that leak until you can replace it properly." Before she could protest, he had already carried the old aluminum ladder from behind the shed. Within minutes, he was carefully securing loose shingles and clearing clogged debris from the gutter with practiced confidence. Emily watched through the kitchen window while packing Noah's lunch. His movements were steady, efficient, and surprisingly precise. He did not work like someone guessing his way through a repair. He worked like a man who believed every problem deserved his full attention, no matter how small. Noah ran outside wearing his oversized backpack and looked up with wide eyes. "Wow, you can fix roofs too." The man climbed down with an easy smile. "Sometimes the smallest repairs prevent the biggest problems." Noah considered that answer seriously before nodding as though he had just learned an important life lesson. During breakfast, the stranger thanked Emily again for her kindness and quietly asked if there was anything he could do in return before leaving. Emily shook her head. "The only thing I need is enough hours in the day." She laughed softly, but exhaustion lingered behind her smile. She explained that after dropping Noah at school, she would spend 6 hours stocking shelves at the grocery store before heading across town to clean office buildings until nearly 10 that night. The stranger listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with every word. "That is a heavy burden for one person," he finally said. Emily shrugged. "Bills do not become lighter just because you are tired." A few minutes later, as Emily searched every drawer for her missing car keys, Noah suddenly shouted from the living room, "Mom, the heater is making that funny noise again." Emily closed her eyes for a brief second. "Not today," she whispered under her breath. The stranger knelt beside the aging heater, removed the front panel with careful hands, and adjusted a loose connection before cleaning years of dust from the vent. The old furnace hummed quietly back to life. Warm air slowly filled the little house. Emily stared in disbelief. "How did you know how to do that?" He wiped his hands with an old cloth and answered with another calm smile. "When something is important to people, it deserves to work properly." Before Emily could ask another question, a black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly through the neighborhood several blocks away. It never reached her street before turning in another direction, but the stranger noticed it through the front window. For the first time since she had met him, the peaceful expression on his face disappeared, replaced by the briefest flicker of concern before he quietly looked away, as though hoping no one else had seen it. Emily dropped Noah off at school just as the morning bell echoed across the playground. She reminded him to be kind, hugged him tightly, and watched until he disappeared through the front doors before climbing into her aging sedan. The engine hesitated twice before finally starting. She smiled with quiet relief, silently thanking the stranger for repairing the heater because she could not have afforded another repair bill this week. Back at the little house, the man stood alone on the porch, watching the empty street. The neighborhood was waking slowly. Delivery trucks rolled past. Children rode bicycles through puddles left by the storm. For a few peaceful minutes, everything appeared ordinary. Hundreds of miles away in downtown Chicago, nothing was ordinary. The top floor of Brooks' Capitol buzzed with an anxiety no quarterly report had ever created. Executives gathered around a polished conference table while dozens of unanswered phone calls flashed across screens. A woman in her early 40s, Grace Holloway, the company's chief operating officer, stood near the window holding a tablet with increasingly troubling updates. "Still nothing?" one board member asked. Grace slowly shook her head. His vehicle was found yesterday afternoon near the state highway after the storm. His phone stopped transmitting shortly afterward. Security has expanded the search radius to every surrounding county. Another executive rubbed his forehead. "The shareholders are already asking questions. The press has noticed," he canceled. "Every meeting. We cannot keep this quiet much longer." Grace remained calm, even though worry lingered behind her composed expression. "Do not think about investors right now. Find Ethan." Across another room, members of the private security team studied maps, traffic cameras, gas station receipts, and weather reports. One investigator pointed toward a cluster of small rural communities. If he avoided the highways because of flooding, he could have reached any of these towns on foot. Another nodded. "He has done this before." Several younger employees looked confused. "Done what?" The older investigator answered without looking up. "Disappear. Whenever the pressure becomes too loud, he walks away from the world for a day or two. Usually no one notices because he comes back before anyone realizes he was gone." Grace quietly added, "This time is different." His wallet, phone, and vehicle were all left behind. Silence settled over the room. Back in the small Kansas town, the stranger finished sweeping leaves away from Emily's front steps with an old push broom he had found beside the shed. He paused as another dark sport utility vehicle slowly drove past the neighborhood. It moved more carefully this time, almost searching. The vehicle continued toward the next block before disappearing behind rows of modest homes. The man lowered his eyes and returned the broom exactly where he had found it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Dawson walked across the street carrying a plate of homemade muffins. She glanced toward the stranger with obvious suspicion before handing the plate to him instead of Emily. "Tell that young mother she works too hard," she said, "and tell her she is too trusting." The man smiled politely. "She is kind." Mrs. Dawson folded her arms. "Kind people usually get hurt first." He looked across the quiet neighborhood before answering in a voice so soft she almost missed it. "Sometimes kind people save lives without ever knowing it." She frowned. unsure what he meant, then returned home. The stranger watched her go before lifting his eyes toward the distant horizon where storm clouds had finally broken apart, revealing bright blue sky. Somewhere beyond those fields, an entire corporate empire was searching desperately for the man standing in front of a weathered little house. Yet the only place he truly felt invisible was the one place where someone had welcomed him without asking who he was. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a brilliant shade of blue, but Emily's day only seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. Her feet ached from standing behind the grocery store register since sunrise, and now she hurried through the parking lot toward her aging sedan, hoping it would start one more time. She turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed once, then fell silent. She tried again. Nothing. Resting her forehead against the steering wheel, she closed her eyes for a brief moment. There was no room left in her budget for another surprise. She quietly called the auto repair shop she had trusted for years. The mechanic listened patiently before apologizing. "Emily, I can tow it over, but if it is the starter or the electrical system, you are probably looking at $800 or more." She thanked him anyway, ended the call, and looked at the $20 bill folded inside her wallet. It would barely cover groceries for the weekend. 40 minutes later, she finally reached home after accepting a ride from a coworker. She had barely stepped onto the porch before Noah ran into her arms. "Mom, I got a gold star in reading today." Emily hugged him tightly, allowing herself one genuine smile. "I knew you would." The stranger was repairing the loose hinge on the front gate with nothing more than a screwdriver he had found in the shed. He looked up immediately and noticed the exhaustion she could no longer hide. "Something happened," he said quietly. Emily tried to laugh it away. "Just one of those days." Before she could say anything else, her phone rang. The landlord's name appeared on the screen. She answered with a polite voice that slowly faded as she listened. "I understand. Yes, I know I am behind. Please, just give me until next Friday." She thanked him several times before ending the call. Noah watched her face carefully. "Are we in trouble?" Emily knelt beside him and gently brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "No, sweetheart. We're just going to keep doing what we always do. We keep trying." That evening, while Noah colored pictures at the kitchen table, the stranger quietly stepped outside. He looked down the empty road before reaching into the inside pocket of his worn coat. Hidden beneath the torn lining was a slim metal card unlike any ordinary business card. His thumb rested against it for several seconds. One phone call could erase every financial problem inside that little house before sunrise. One call could send drivers, accountants, attorneys, and contractors rushing to this address. Instead, he slowly slid the card back into his pocket. When he returned inside, Emily was calculating bills with a pencil that had been sharpened until it was barely longer than her fingers. She crossed out one payment after another, searching for numbers that refused to add up. "If there is anything I can do," the stranger said carefully, "please allow me to help." Emily looked up with a tired but steady smile. "You already have." He frowned slightly. "I have done very little." She shook her head. "You fixed the roof. You fixed the heater. You made Noah laugh. This house has felt lighter since you walked through that door." He hesitated before speaking again. "What if someone offered to solve all of this?" Emily folded the unpaid bills into a neat stack. "Then I would thank them with all my heart." She paused, meeting his eyes without embarrassment or self-pity. "But I would still need to earn my own way. Kindness should lift people up, not make them feel smaller." Her words settled quietly between them. For the first time in years, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements found himself speechless because a woman with almost nothing had reminded him of a truth that wealth alone could never buy. The next morning began with an unusual stillness that made the entire neighborhood feel as though it were holding its breath. Emily packed Noah's lunch, helped him button his jacket, and promised they would celebrate his reading award with homemade pancakes over the weekend, even though she quietly wondered whether she could afford the extra eggs. The stranger stood near the kitchen window, watching sunlight spill across the wet street, where puddles reflected the clear blue sky left behind by the storm. He seemed distracted, glancing toward the road every few minutes without explaining why. Emily noticed, but chose not to ask. Some people carried burdens they could only put into words when they were ready. After she drove Noah to school and left for her afternoon shift, the little house became silent once again. Less than an hour later, the silence was broken by the distant sound of engines. One black sport utility vehicle entered the neighborhood, followed by another, then a third. They moved slowly, almost respectfully, before stopping several houses away. Men and women dressed in dark business attire stepped out, scanning the quiet street with remarkable discipline rather than urgency. A silver sedan arrived moments later. Grace Holloway stepped onto the sidewalk, studying every house until her eyes stopped on the modest home with the patched roof. She took a slow breath before walking toward the porch. The stranger was already standing outside waiting for her. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Grace smiled with visible relief. "We have been looking everywhere for you." He nodded gently. "I know." Her eyes briefly drifted toward the repaired gutter, the old rocking chair, and the flower pots made from painted coffee cans. "The board has postponed 3 major meetings. Investors are demanding answers. Your security team has barely slept." He looked back at the little house. "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," Grace answered honestly. "Only worried." He smiled faintly. "Good." She lowered her voice. "Ethan, everyone is waiting for you." At that exact moment, Emily turned onto her street after receiving permission to leave work early because a delivery truck had broken down. She slowed her aging sedan as she noticed the unfamiliar vehicles parked outside her home. Her first thought was that something terrible had happened. She rushed out of the car and hurried across the yard. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Several security officers instinctively stepped aside, making room for her without saying a word. Grace turned toward Emily with a warm but respectful expression. "You must be Miss Carter." Emily nodded uncertainly. "Yes." Grace looked back at the man standing beside the porch. "Thank you for taking care of Mr. Ethan Brooks." Emily blinked, unable to process the words she had just heard. "Mr. Brooks," Grace continued gently, "Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Capital." Emily slowly turned toward the quiet man who had slept on her worn sofa, repaired her roof, washed his own coffee mug, and shared tomato soup at her kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan offered the same calm smile he had given her the night she opened the door. "I was hoping to tell you myself," he said softly. Emily searched his face, remembering every small act of humility, every simple conversation, every quiet thank you. None of it had been an act. The truth was simply far larger than anything she had imagined. Across the street, Mrs. Dawson stepped onto her porch, staring in disbelief as several members of the security team respectfully addressed the quiet stranger with the same 2 words that instantly transformed the entire neighborhood into complete silence. "Good morning, sir." Emily stood frozen on the front porch as the quiet man she had welcomed into her home was surrounded by people who clearly knew exactly who he was. The expensive vehicles, the tailored suits, the respectful silence, none of it seemed real. She looked back at Ethan, searching for the weary traveler she had met during the storm, and somehow she found him still standing there beneath everything else. He had not changed. Only what she knew about him had. Noah's school bus pulled to the curb a few minutes later, and the little boy hopped off carrying a paper covered with colorful stars. He stopped in surprise when he saw the unfamiliar vehicles lining the street. Running toward the porch, he smiled the moment he spotted Ethan. "You are still here." Noah shouted happily before wrapping his small arms around him without hesitation. Every executive and security officer watched in stunned silence as one of the most influential business leaders in the country smiled with genuine warmth and hugged the little boy back. Ethan knelt to Noah's eye level. "I promised I would not leave without saying goodbye." Noah held up his paper proudly. "I got another gold star today." Ethan studied it carefully as though it were the most important document he had seen all week. "I am very proud of you," he said sincerely. Grace quietly looked away, realizing she had not heard Ethan sound that relaxed in years. Emily finally found her voice. "Why did you not tell us?" Ethan stood slowly. "Because the moment you knew my name, everything would change." He looked around the small yard before meeting her eyes again. "You opened your door because you thought I needed help, not because you expected anything in return. I wanted to know what that felt like." Emily folded her arms gently. "You could have trusted us with the truth." He nodded. "Perhaps, but then I would never have known whether your kindness belonged to me or to my title." A member of the security team stepped forward carrying a leather briefcase. Ethan accepted it, opened it briefly, then closed it again without removing anything. He turned back to Emily. Your landlord has already been contacted. Your mortgage can be paid. Your car can be replaced. Noah's education can be fully funded. Whatever you need, I can make it happen today. Emily listened quietly before shaking her head with a calm smile. That is generous, but I cannot accept gifts simply because I helped someone during a storm. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Ethan looked at her with quiet admiration. You would refuse all of it. I did not help a billionaire, Emily answered softly. I helped a cold man standing alone in the rain. If I accept payment now, it changes why I opened the door. The words settled over everyone present like the final drops of a passing storm. Ethan closed the briefcase without another argument. Instead, he smiled more genuinely than anyone there had seen in a very long time. Then allow me to thank you another way. Emily tilted her head slightly. How? Ethan looked across the neighborhood where weathered houses stood beside cracked sidewalks and aging trees. By creating opportunities instead of obligations. He extended his hand, not as a billionaire offering charity, but as one human being offering respect to another. You reminded me that real dignity cannot be purchased. I hope one day you will allow me to build something meaningful with you, not for you. Emily looked at his outstretched hand for a brief moment before shaking it. Neither of them realized that the quiet agreement made on that modest front porch would soon grow into something that would change far more lives than either of them could possibly imagine. 3 weeks passed, yet the memory of that rainy night refused to leave either of them. Emily returned to her ordinary routine, stocking shelves before sunrise, cleaning office buildings after dark, and helping Noah with homework in the few quiet hours that remained. Life had not suddenly become easier simply because she had met one of the wealthiest men in America. If anything, she worked even harder, determined to prove that kindness had never been an investment expecting a reward. Then, one Monday morning, an unfamiliar envelope arrived in her mailbox. It contained no check, no expensive gift, and no extravagant promise. Inside was a single invitation printed on plain white paper. Brooks Capital Community Initiative. Candidate interview. Emily frowned with quiet confusion. There was no guarantee of employment, no mention of special treatment, only a scheduled interview and a note signed personally by Ethan. If you still believe people deserve opportunities more than handouts, I hope you will come. Emily read the sentence twice before folding the letter carefully and placing it back inside the envelope. 2 days later, she walked into Brooks Capital headquarters wearing the same navy blazer she had worn to every important interview during the past 5 years. It had been mended twice at the sleeve, but it was clean, neatly pressed, and carried with quiet confidence. The glass tower rose high above downtown Chicago, reflecting clouds across its polished windows. Employees hurried through the spacious lobby, while digital displays announced projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Emily suddenly remembered the quiet man who had washed his own coffee mug in her tiny kitchen. It was difficult to believe both versions of Ethan belonged to the same person. Grace welcomed her personally before leading her into a conference room where several department directors were already waiting. Ethan entered last, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the respected executive the business world admired. Yet when he smiled at Emily, she recognized the same calm expression from the little porch after the storm. Thank you for coming, he said. Emily nodded politely. Thank you for inviting me. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Nobody asked about the storm. Nobody mentioned the shelter she had offered or the meals they had shared. Instead, they asked how she would distribute limited resources during a natural disaster, how she would choose between competing community programs, and what qualities defined real leadership. Emily answered every question honestly, drawing from years of balancing impossible budgets, comforting frightened neighbors, and raising Noah without expecting anyone else to solve her problems. When the final question arrived, Ethan leaned forward slightly. Why do you think someone should lead a charitable foundation? Emily considered the question carefully before answering. Because they understand that dignity matters as much as assistance. If people leave feeling grateful but ashamed, then we have failed them. The goal should never be to rescue someone forever. The goal is to help them stand confidently on their own. Silence settled across the room. Several executives quietly exchanged thoughtful glances. Ethan slowly smiled before closing the folder in front of him. That, he said softly, is the answer I was hoping everyone here would hear. Later that afternoon, after every other candidate had finished, Grace entered Ethan's office carrying the evaluation reports. She smiled knowingly before placing them on his desk. She received the highest score from every interviewer. Ethan looked through the office window toward the busy city below before quietly replying, "I expected competence. I did not expect wisdom." Across town, Emily picked Noah up from school and walked home as they always did, completely unaware that the decision made inside Brooks Capital that afternoon would soon transform not only her own future, but the future of thousands of families who had spent years waiting for someone to see them with the same compassion she had shown a stranger standing alone in the rain. 1 year later, the little house on Maple Street looked almost exactly the same from the outside. The white paint was still slightly weathered, the front porch remained modest, and the rocking chair still rested beneath the repaired roof, where rain no longer leaked into a bucket by the front door. Emily had insisted on keeping the home instead of moving into something larger because, as she often told Noah, some places were too full of memories to leave behind. What had changed was not the size of the house, but the number of people who knocked on its door. Every month, families from nearby towns gathered there before attending community workshops organized through the Brooks Capital Community Initiative. They came for career counseling, emergency assistance, financial planning, and practical support designed to help them build stable futures rather than depend on temporary relief. Emily had become the executive director of the initiative, not because Ethan had offered her charity, but because she had earned the position through her wisdom, compassion, and relentless dedication. She visited every neighborhood personally, listened before speaking, and never forgot the feeling of counting her last $20 while wondering how she would pay rent. The programs expanded across several states, helping thousands of single parents, struggling families, and elderly neighbors facing unexpected hardships. Inside every office hung the same simple reminder Emily had written during her first week. Respect always comes before assistance. Ethan refused to remove those words, even after marketing consultants suggested something more polished. "Those 5 words built this entire mission," he replied. Noah was 9 years old now, taller than before and proudly carrying home books instead of worries. One afternoon he asked Ethan, "Do you ever miss being anonymous?" Ethan smiled as they repaired another loose fence board outside the house. "Sometimes." Noah looked puzzled. "Then why do people always smile when they see you now?" Ethan rested the hammer beside him before answering. "Because I finally learned that being respected is different from being known." Grace often joked that the biggest transformation inside Brooks Capital had not been financial but personal. Executives volunteered in community projects. Managers spent time listening to employees instead of only reviewing reports. Annual success was measured not only by profits, but by lives improved. Shareholders questioned the new philosophy at first, yet the company grew stronger than ever because trust proved to be an investment with remarkable returns. On the anniversary of the storm, dark clouds gathered once again above the quiet neighborhood. Rain began falling just after sunset, tapping gently against the familiar porch roof. Emily opened the front door and hung a small wooden sign beside the entrance. The words were simple enough for anyone to understand. "If you need shelter from the storm, you are welcome here." Ethan stood beside her, reading the sign without speaking. It was worth more than every award displayed in his corporate office. Across the street, Mrs. Dawson smiled from her window as another traveler paused to escape the rain beneath the porch. Emily welcomed the stranger inside without asking a single question. Ethan quietly carried another chair to the table and placed a warm bowl of soup in front of their unexpected guest. Nothing about that moment felt extraordinary anymore. It simply felt right. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that one act of kindness changes a life. It is that one act of kindness teaches someone to pass that kindness forward until strangers become neighbors, neighbors become family, and the door that once sheltered one forgotten traveler remains open for everyone who needs hope on a rainy night.